On the last Saturday of September, 1998, a 1987 Ford pickup truck with a cracked left headlight and a rear bumper held by a single bolt turned off State Highway 2 and followed a hand-painted plywood sign toward the Gallatin County Fairgrounds. The truck was the color it had always been, which was to say, the color of something that had once been blue and had since made a long peace with rust and primer and the particular fading that comes not from neglect, but from decades of honest Montana sun. It drove the way old trucks drive when the man behind the wheel knows exactly where every rattle comes from and has decided one by one that none of them matter. The parking area was already thick with vehicles by 9 in the morning. Crew cab pickups, most of them new, lined the grass in rows so orderly they might have been arranged by someone paid to care about such things. Trailers sat unhitched along the fence line. A row of vendor tents stretched the length of the south lot, their white canopies bright against the September sky, and from those tents came the particular kind of noise that money makes when it is being spent enthusiastically and without regret. There were optics vendors and ammunition vendors and men selling tactical gear in quantities and varieties that suggested a kind of preparedness that had nothing to do with farming or ranching or any of the things that had originally made this part of Montana what it was. The 1987 Ford pulled in slowly and found a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the other trucks, close to a fence post that leaned slightly north. The engine shuddered once after the key came out the way engines do when they have been running hard and are not quite ready to admit the day is pausing. Then it went quiet, and the man inside did not get out. He sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just resting the way a man rests his hands on something familiar when he is thinking about something else entirely. He was 69 years old, and he looked it the way good wood looks its age, not broken down, but marked by time in ways that told you something about what it had been through. His face was the kind of face that takes decades to build the lines deep around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth, the jaw still set and square beneath a close-cropped beard that had gone completely white sometime in the last 10 years, without him paying much attention to it. His hands on the wheel were large and scarred in the particular way of men who have spent their lives working with leather and metal, and the tools that shape both. He wore a flannel shirt, dark green, buttoned to the second button from the top. Work pants creased that morning, not by a dry cleaner, but by a man who still believed that a crease meant something. Boots that had been polished, though the toes were scuffed in the way that polish can only delay, never prevent. On the seat beside him sat a worn canvas bag, olive drab, the kind the Army had issued in another era. Inside it was a Remington 700 in .308 Winchester. That did not belong to him. He had borrowed it 3 days ago from his neighbor, Dale Pruitt, a retired school teacher who kept it oiled and cased and had not fired it in 6 years. When Silas Croft had knocked on Dale's door and asked to borrow the rifle, Dale had studied him for a long moment before saying without further questions that he could keep it as long as he needed. Silas sat in the truck for 10 minutes after the engine went quiet. He watched a group of young men in matching black shirts cross the parking lot, carrying rifle cases that cost more than his truck. He watched a vendor in a polo shirt set up a display of laser rangefinders with the enthusiasm of a man who truly believed in what he was selling. He watched a child of about 8 pull her father toward the cotton candy stand by the main gate, both of them oblivious to everything happening around them, which struck Silas as the most sensible thing he had seen all morning. Then he looked at the empty passenger seat. Pearl had sat there for 31 years. He still thought about her presence in that seat the way you think about a word on the tip of your tongue, something that should be there and simply isn't, and the absence is its own kind of weight. She had been gone 2 years now, 2 years and 4 months, if he was counting, which he was. He reached up and took the thermos from the dashboard. It was a tin thermos, the kind sold at hardware stores in the early 1950s, dented along one side from a fall he had taken in circumstances he did not revisit in daylight if he could avoid it. The thermos held black coffee, the same as it had held since 1953, and he drank one slow mouthful and set it back. Then he opened the door and got out of the truck. He did not do it with ceremony. He did not psych himself up or square his shoulders or take a breath for the benefit of some imagined audience. He simply opened the door, picked up the canvas bag, and walked across the gravel lot toward the registration tent. The way a man walks when he has already made his decision in private, and there is nothing left to decide. The Gallatin County Precision Rifle Expo had been running for 2 days. It was the brainchild of a man named Nash Holloway, who had built a modest real estate empire in Bozeman during the late 1980s and had recently pivoted with the confidence of a man who has made money in one field and assumes the skills transfer freely into the outdoor sporting goods industry. Nash Holloway was 44 years old, wore fleece vests in colors that did not exist in nature, and had a handshake that lasted precisely long enough to establish dominance without crossing into rudeness. The expo had drawn sponsors from 3 states and exhibitors from as far as Oregon. There were precision rifle clinics and ballistics seminars, and a dinner the first night, at which Nash had given a speech about the future of the sport that had gone on 17 minutes longer than anyone needed. But the centerpiece of the 2-day event, the thing that had gotten the expo written up in 2 regional hunting publications and mentioned on a Bozeman radio station, was the 1,000-yard challenge. The setup was simple. A steel plate 12 inches across, painted white, sat at exactly 1,000 yards from the firing line on a flat stretch of Montana field that Nash had leased from a rancher named Gerber for the weekend. The challenge was open to any registered competitor. 1 round, iron sights only. No scopes, no optics of any kind. And the prize, $15,000 in cash, sat in a clear acrylic case on the judge's table beside the tent, visible from the firing line, which Nash Holloway understood was not an accident of placement. The iron sights rule was Nash's masterstroke, or so he believed. Modern precision shooters had grown up with optics, glass that could resolve a target at 1,000 yards into something the size of a dinner plate. Take the glass away and you were left with a small notch and a small post and a target that at that distance was theoretically visible, but practically indistinguishable from the shimmer and drift of the September morning. Nash had run the numbers with a retired competitive shooter he knew from a golf club, and the retired shooter had told him flatly, and with some satisfaction, that the shot was possible in theory and effectively impossible in practice. The kind of possible that had not been routinely demonstrated since the era of trained military marksmen who had spent years learning to do things that scopes had made unnecessary. Nash had set the prize at $15,000 because it sounded serious without actually being serious. The real value of the prize was not in the paying of it. It was in the not paying of it. Every failed attempt built the legend of the shot. Every failed attempt was a conversation at dinner, and a story retold at the bar, and a reason to come back next year to watch someone else try and fail. By the end of the 2nd day, 63 competitors had attempted the shot. 63 had failed. The failures had been instructive in their variety. Some men had shot high and to the left, which the range officer noted was the most common error of right-handed shooters, compensating for a wind they had read incorrectly. Some had shot close enough that the spotters with binoculars had gone quiet for a hopeful second before confirming the miss. One man from Billings had actually grazed the lower edge of the plate, which the rules specified did not count as a hit, and had stood at the bench for a long time afterward, doing the math of how close he had come before quietly stepping away. The competitors were almost without exception men in their 20s and 30s. Several of them wore sponsorship patches. Several had rifles that had been built to custom specifications and cost figures that Silas would not have spent on a vehicle. They were capable shooters. Many of them were excellent shooters. They knew ballistics and wind drift and the mathematics of long-range precision with the fluency of a generation that had learned these things from manuals and forums and coaching rather than from necessity. What they did not have or had not demonstrated was the particular kind of stillness that the shot required. The stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the presence of something else entirely, something quieter and harder to learn from a manual. Silas did not know any of this when he walked to the registration tent. He had read the notice in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle 4 weeks earlier. On a Tuesday morning in his workshop behind Sadie's house, sitting at his workbench with the thermos and a half-repaired saddle flap that was giving him trouble at the rivet line. He had read it twice slowly and then folded the paper and set it under the workbench and gone back to the rivet line. He had not told Sadie. Sadie was 38 years old, which still struck Silas as improbable on most days. She ran the small bookkeeping business she had built from 2 clients to 11 over the past 6 years, working out of the front room of the house that had been Pearl's house and was now hers, or would be hers, once the mortgage was resolved, which it had not been. Silas knew about the 3 missed payments. He knew because he had seen the envelope from the bank sitting on the kitchen counter one evening when Sadie thought he had already gone to the workshop. He had not mentioned it. Sadie had not mentioned it. This was an arrangement that suited both of them in the way that arrangements between stubborn people who love each other sometimes do. The registration check had been $40. He had sent it by mail with a handwritten note giving his name and age and confirming that he understood the rules of the challenge. He had received a confirmation postcard back 2 weeks later, and he had put it in his shirt pocket and not taken it out since. The woman behind the registration table was in her late 20s, competent and brisk with a laptop that she typed on without looking at the keys. She processed entries with the efficiency of someone who had been at it for 2 days and had developed a rhythm. When Silas set his confirmation postcard on the table, she picked it up, scanned it, and began typing. Then she stopped. She looked at the postcard again. Then she looked up at him the way people look when a name produces a flicker of something, an association, a partial recognition that they cannot quite place. For a moment she seemed about to say something. Then she looked back down at the screen and finished typing and slid him a paper number. 64. He was folding it when the voice came from behind him in line. The man was 34 years old, which Silas could not have known precisely, but could have estimated within a few years from the ease in his posture and the way he wore his confidence like something he had always owned rather than something he had earned. He was broad across the shoulders and wore a black shirt with a logo on the chest pocket that indicated a sponsorship relationship with a rifle manufacturer that Silas had vaguely heard of. His boots were new. His rifle case was the hard plastic kind with foam inserts cut to the specific shape of the firearm inside. His name was Wyatt Mercer, and he had placed in the top 5 of every significant precision rifle competition he had entered in the past 3 years. Wyatt had been watching Silas from the moment the old man walked up to the table. He had watched the way the registration woman reacted to the name, and he had heard the name himself. And when he heard it, something had moved across his face that was not quite recognition, and not quite discomfort, and not quite anything he was going to examine with other people watching. He covered it the way he covered most things he did not wish to examine, which was by moving forward quickly. "Pal," he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear without appearing to try, "why don't you go home and let the grown men finish? You're gonna hurt yourself with that old cannon, and then we're all gonna feel bad about it. There was laughter. Not universal, but enough. Two men behind Wyatt laughed the way men laugh when someone louder than them says something they might not have said themselves, but are willing to endorse by proximity. Silas did not turn around. He picked up his canvas bag, tucked the number 64 into his breast pocket beside his confirmation postcard, and walked away from the registration table toward the firing line. His pace was the same as it had been when he crossed the parking lot. Nothing in him hurried and nothing in him flinched. And if Wyatt Mercer felt the particular dissatisfaction of a man who expected a reaction and received none, he did not show it in front of the people around him. The range officer at the firing line was a man named Hank Yardley. He was 69 years old, the same age as Silas, though you would not have placed them as contemporaries if you saw them separately. Hank was thinner, grayer, with the particular leanness of a man who had never stopped moving. He had served as range officer for both days of the expo and had watched 63 men fail at the shot with a professional detachment that he had spent decades cultivating. He noted what they did wrong with the precision of someone who understood at a level below explanation exactly what right looked like. He had a clipboard with a running list of names and numbers and results. Number 64 had not been checked in yet when he looked up from it and saw the old man in the flannel shirt walking toward him across the grass. Hank Yardley stopped what he was doing. It was a subtle thing. The clipboard stayed in his hand. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted the way attention shifts when you see something that triggers a category in your mind that you thought you had closed for good. He watched Silas approach and said nothing yet, just watched. Before Silas reached the firing line, he walked past the portable restrooms set up near the south fence, and he went inside one of them, and he stood in front of the small square mirror mounted above the hand-washing station, and he looked at himself. His hands were trembling. It was not the shaking of illness. It was the shaking of a man who has decided to do something and is now in the small, private moment before it becomes real, being visited by every reasonable objection. His mind had been overruling for 4 weeks. He was 69 years old. The rifle in the bag at his feet was borrowed. He had not fired a precision round at any significant distance since an occasion he did not visit in daylight, and that occasion had been 46 years ago. He could still walk back to the truck. He could be on the highway in 10 minutes and home by noon, and he could sit in the workshop and finish the rivet line on the saddle flap and drink the rest of the coffee from the thermos. And no one would know. He had been here except Dale Pruitt, who would not say anything, and the woman at the registration table who would not remember him by Monday. He stood and looked at himself in the mirror, and in the silence of the portable restroom with the sound of the distant crowd coming through the plastic walls, he heard Pearl's voice the way he sometimes did in the workshop, not as a sound exactly, but as a certainty that settled over him. She had said it twice in the last year of her life, once when he was sitting by her hospital bed in November, and once on the last morning in March when she had been more alert than expected and had held his hand across the blanket with a grip that surprised both of them. She had said, "Do not let what you were given die quietly in a workshop, Silas." He had not understood it then, or had understood it only partially, the way you understand something when you are not ready for the full weight of it. He looked at his hands on the edge of the sink. He breathed in once through his nose, slow and deliberate. Then he reached into the pocket of his work pants and took out his father's watch. A Hamilton from 1941. The crystal cracked along one edge from a fall that had happened before the fall of the thermos. He placed it carefully in his breast pocket inside his shirt against his chest. Then he picked up the canvas bag and walked out into the September morning. Hank Yardley was waiting at the bench when Silas arrived. The range officer went through the standard briefing with the same measured clarity he had used 63 times before. 1 round. 3 minutes total. Played at 1,000 yards 12 inches across white. Current wind reading 6 miles per hour south-southwest, with gusts estimated at 8. He stated these things without inflection, and watched Silas's face as he said them. Silas nodded once. Hank picked up the Remington 700 from the canvas bag with both hands. The way you pick up someone else's property when you intend to return it in the same condition you received it. He checked the bolt, confirmed the chamber, verified the caliber marking on the barrel. Standard inspection. He had done it 63 times. He turned the rifle slightly and looked at the serial number. He went very still. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he set the rifle down on the bench in front of Silas carefully, in exactly the position a shooter would want it, and he stepped back to his position and looked out at the field. He did not say anything, but he did not move away from the bench the way he had moved away from the first 63. He stayed. He found a position slightly off to the left, where he could see the firing line and the distant white plate both, and he stood there with his clipboard at his side, and he waited. A small crowd had gathered along the rope barrier behind the firing line by this point. Word moved through an event like this quickly. The way word moves when something is about to happen that the crowd believes will be either interesting or embarrassing, and the crowd was not yet certain which this would be. Some of them had cameras. Several were already filming on the small handheld devices that were becoming common that year. A few older men stood with their arms crossed and their expressions neutral, which is the expression of men who have learned to form no opinion before the evidence is in. Wyatt Mercer was there. He stood at the rope with one boot crossed over the other, and his arms folded, and a small, fixed smile that said to anyone who read it that he was confident enough in the outcome that he could afford to be patient. Silas sat down at the bench. He did not adjust the rifle immediately. He placed both hands flat on the surface of the bench beside it, palms down, and he sat straight, and he closed his eyes. The crowd waited. Someone near the back said something low that produced a ripple of laughter. Wyatt shook his head once slowly, the performance of a man being proved right by the evidence of his own patience. Hank Yardley looked at none of this. He looked at Silas. The old man sat with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the bench, and his breathing so measured that from 15 feet away you could not see his chest move. One of the older men along the rope line uncrossed his arms. He had seen something or the beginning of something that required a different posture. He did not know what it was yet. Inside the quiet of whatever Silas Croft carried behind his eyes, there was no Montana fairground. There was a ridge. It came the way it always came when he allowed it, which was not often and not lightly. February 1952, on the Korean Peninsula, on a ridge that did not have a name on any map he had ever seen, at a temperature that made the metal of the rifle burn against bare skin if you were not careful. The sky had been the color of old pewter, and it had been that color for 4 days. The slope below the ridge dropped into a narrow valley where the road ran, and somewhere in that valley, at a distance the young spotter beside him had calculated at roughly 900 yards, a crew-operated weapon was making it impossible for 4 men from their unit to move in any direction. The scope was gone. A piece of mortar casing had caught the rear bell of it the day before and left it a ruin of cracked glass, still attached to the mount by habit rather than function. He had the iron sights. He had one clear angle through a gap in the ridge vegetation that would close in 30 seconds when the wind shifted the branches back. He had a spotter beside him who was 22 years old and breathing too fast, but doing his job anyway, reading the wind off a strip of cloth he had tied to a branch 3 minutes earlier. He did not know with certainty that he could make the shot. He knew that if he did not, the 4 men in the valley were out of options. He had exhaled until his lungs were empty, and then he had waited at the bottom of the breath in the particular suspended moment that experienced marksmen know and cannot fully explain, where the pulse slows and the hands go quiet and the world reduces itself to a single fixed point. And then he had applied pressure. 46 years later, in a fairground in Montana, Silas Croft opened his eyes. He did not open them quickly. They came open the way light comes at dawn, gradually and without drama. He shifted on the bench to get his position settled, his cheek against the stock, adjusted his grip by a fraction he could feel but not measure. He checked his sight picture. He made one small adjustment to the rear sight, a quarter turn so small that no one watching could have seen it. The September wind moved across the field. He watched the grass at the 200-yard mark and the grass at the 500-yard mark, and the small flag on a post at the 750-yard mark that Nash Holloway had installed for ballistic reference. He read them in sequence the way you read a sentence, and he understood what they were telling him. He settled his sight on the white plate that was barely visible at the end of that long, flat reach of Montana grass, a small, pale shape shimmering in the morning air like something that wanted to disappear. He breathed out. He found the bottom of the breath. He waited in that still place, the place that is not patience and not calm, but something older than both, and when the moment aligned the way moments align, when you have learned to wait for them and not force them. He applied pressure to the trigger with the smooth, unhurried certainty of a man who has done this before and is not in any particular doubt about what comes next. The Remington fired. The sound crossed the field and came back from the hills as an echo, before anyone had processed what they were hearing. The crowd went silent in a way that crowds rarely go silent all at once, and without degrees, as if someone had cut a wire. For one full second, there was nothing from the far end of the field. Then the spotter on the radio said one word: hit. He said it the way people say things when the outcome has arrived that they were told to expect, but somehow did not actually believe until this moment. He said it clearly and without decoration. And then he said it again, because the word needed to be said twice to be real. The plate had been struck in the center, not at the edge, not at the margin, in the center. The crowd behind the rope did not respond immediately. There was a delay, a collective processing, and in that delay, Silas put the rifle down on the bench, with the same care with which he had picked it up. He reached into his breast pocket and he held his father's watch in his closed fist for a moment. Then the sound broke from somewhere in the crowd, a single sharp whoop, and the applause that followed it was not polite applause or sporting applause, but the real kind, the involuntary kind that starts before people have decided to clap. Silas did not turn to receive it. He sat for a moment on the bench and looked out at the field at the white plate 1,000 yards away that was now unremarkable against the September grass. Then he stood slowly and picked up his canvas bag and turned to face Hank Yardley. The range officer was looking at him with an expression that Silas had not seen on a stranger's face in a very long time. It was not admiration exactly, or not only that. It was something more particular and more personal. The expression of a man who is in the presence of something he knows deeply and has not encountered in a long time. Sir Hank said. His voice was controlled in the way of someone who is controlling it deliberately. He extended his hand. Silas shook it. Hank held the grip a moment longer than a handshake requires. He said, almost too quietly for anyone nearby to hear, "Where did you learn that Silas looked at him. The question settled in the space between them and did not require an immediate answer. They were the same age. They were standing on Montana grass in the September of 1998, and for one moment in the specific quality of the silence between them, they were also somewhere else entirely, on a ridge, in the cold, in a year that was farther away than mathematics could measure. Before Silas could answer, a sound came from the parking lot behind the crowd. The sound of a vehicle door and then footsteps on gravel. And then the particular quality of attention that a crowd develops when someone significant has arrived even before it knows who the someone is. Silas did not look toward the parking lot. He was still looking at Hank Yardley. And Hank Yardley was still looking at him. And between them, in the way of two men who have lived long enough to know when something is about to change, was the shared understanding that the morning was not finished with either of them yet. The man who stepped out of the black SUV was in his late 60s and moved the way certain men move when they have spent enough years being the most important person in a room that the quality has become involuntary. Not performance, not arrogance exactly, just the particular economy of motion that develops in men who have learned that the room will wait for them and have stopped feeling the need to rush toward it. He was broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, and wore a charcoal sport coat over an open collar that managed to look neither casual nor formal, but something precisely between the two. He was retired Major General Raymond Thatch, though the retired part was a legal designation, more than a lived reality. And he had driven out from Bozeman that morning for a 9:30 appointment with Nash Holloway that had nothing whatsoever to do with an old man and a borrowed rifle. The appointment was about money. Thatch sat on the board of a sporting goods manufacturing company that had been looking for regional sponsorship opportunities, and Nash Holloway had made a persuasive phone call 6 weeks ago, and the Gallatin County Precision Rifle Expo had appeared in the company's quarterly projections as a line item under regional brand development. Thatch had come to sign a check and shake a hand and be back in Bozeman for lunch. He did not know anything about what had happened on the firing line 11 minutes ago. His driver pulled the SUV to the edge of the gravel lot, and Thatch stepped out and looked across the grounds toward the crowd gathered at the rope barrier, which was larger and quieter than he would have expected for a sporting event between sessions. He checked his watch. He was 4 minutes early. He began walking toward the judge's tent where Nash had told him to meet. And as he walked, he passed close to the near edge of the crowd, and he heard the words circulating through it in low voices, the way significant words circulate. He heard center. He heard 1,000 yards. He heard iron sights. He slowed without stopping, the way a man slows when something in his peripheral attention requires more bandwidth than he is currently allocated to it. He looked toward the firing line. He saw the old man in the flannel shirt still standing at the bench with his canvas bag. He saw the range officer holding the old man's hand in a grip that had gone on longer than ceremony required. He saw 60 or 70 people standing in the particular posture of witnesses, not spectators. Thatch stopped walking. Nash Holloway appeared at his elbow from the direction of the judge's tent, slightly out of breath, his fleece vest, a shade of orange, that announced itself from 30 yards. "General," he said, "good to see you. Great timing, we've just had some excitement. One of the competitors made the shot. Technically, there's a small question about equipment eligibility that we're sorting through. But we'll have it resolved quickly, and then we can get to our business." Thatch looked at Nash Holloway for a moment. "What question?" he said. Nash explained the equipment clause, the borrowed rifle, subsection 4.2 of the competitor rules, which specified that all equipment used in the challenge must be the personal property of the registered competitor. Nash had drafted the rules himself 8 months ago, and had included the clause as a general liability measure without anticipating it would ever be invoked in a situation like this one. It was, he said, not a personal matter. It was a rules matter. The integrity of the event required consistency. Thatch said nothing. He looked back toward the firing line. Nash continued. He had already spoken to one of the event attorneys who was on site for the weekend. The clause was clear. The prize money, $15,000, could not be awarded under the current circumstances without exposing the event to liability questions from the 63 other competitors who had attempted the shot, under the assumption that the rules would be uniformly applied. Thatch listened to all of this. What he was watching while Nash talked was the crowd. He had spent 30 years reading crowds, specifically the crowds that form around moments of consequence in military contexts, and he knew what the posture of this one meant. These were not people waiting for a sporting result to be confirmed. These were people who had witnessed something and were now being told that what they had witnessed did not count, and the specific quality of their silence was the silence of people deciding what they think about that. Then, something happened at the rope barrier that redirected everyone's attention at once. Wyatt Mercer unfolded his arms. He had been standing at the rope with the fixed expression of a man whose prediction has been overturned and who has not yet completed the internal process of absorbing that fact. He had been quiet since the spotter's radio confirmation, quieter than anyone near him would have expected, given the volume of his opinions that morning. When the conversation about the equipment clause had begun spreading through the crowd from Nash's direction, Wyatt had listened to it with an expression that cycled through several things in quick succession, none of which settled into agreement. He pushed off from the rope and walked toward Nash Holloway. He was not running. He was not raising his voice. He walked with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. He stopped in front of Nash and said at a volume the surrounding crowd could hear without difficulty that he had read the competitor rules on the event website, and the equipment clause addressed caliber restrictions and mechanical action classifications and prohibited modifications, and that nothing in subsection 4.2 or any adjacent subsection specified that equipment must be personally owned by the competitor. It specified that equipment must meet technical specifications. The Remington 700 met every technical specification listed. He said he had a brother-in-law who practiced civil law in Billings, and that he was prepared to make a phone call if Nash would like a second interpretation. Nash looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was an argument he could win quickly or one that was going to become expensive. The crowd was very still. Silas Croft, standing at the bench 15 feet away, had not moved during this exchange. He was watching it the way he had watched things for 69 years, with the full attention of a man who has learned that observation costs nothing and misses very little. His canvas bag was at his feet. The Remington was on the bench. Hank Yardley had not left his position to the left of the bench, and Silas could feel without looking that Hank was watching him rather than the argument. He did not know why Wyatt Mercer was doing this. He filed the question away without answering it. Nash Holloway was good at many things, and one of them was reading the temperature of a situation before it became a problem. He could not manage. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Wyatt Mercer. He looked at the attorney who was now making his way across the grass from the direction of the vendor tents. And he recognized in the attorney's face the expression of a man who would rather resolve this quietly than have his name associated with what it would become if it were not resolved quietly. He looked at Hank Yardley. He had been looking around Hank all morning the way you look around range officers because they are functional rather than central. But something about Hank's position, The stillness of it, the specificity of his attention toward the old man at the bench, made Nash look at him directly for the first time. Hank was not watching the argument. Hank was watching Silas. And on Hank Yardley's face, if Nash had known how to read it, was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just recognized the moment when the carrying stops. Hank stepped forward from his position. He did not move toward Nash or toward Wyatt. He moved to a point roughly equidistant from both of them, and from the crowd at the rope, a position from which he could be heard by all parties without appearing to address any one of them, which was in its way a very precise calculation. "My name is Henry Yardley," he said. "Most people call me Hank. I've been range officer at this event for 2 days, and I've watched 63 men attempt that shot." He paused. He was not a man who paused for effect. He paused because the next part required him to access something he did not access lightly, and he was making sure the access was steady before he proceeded. In February of 1952, he said, "I was a spotter attached to a reconnaissance unit operating on the Korean Peninsula. I was 22 years old. On the 9th of that month, we were on a ridge above a supply road in temperatures that I will not describe, because the description would sound like exaggeration, and it was not exaggeration. Our unit's scope rifle had been damaged the previous day by mortar fragment. We had iron sights, and we had one angle on the target before the wind shifted the vegetation back and closed it." He stopped again. His voice had not wavered, but the effort of keeping it level was visible if you knew where to look. The man who made the shot that morning was 23 years old. He had been firing precision rifles since he was 14 years old in eastern Montana, and he had a quality that I have spent 46 years trying to describe to people who were not there and have never found the right words for. He saved 4 men that morning, possibly more. Hank turned and looked directly at Silas. "I've been trying to find Silas Croft for 46 years, he said. "I found him this morning when I read his name off a clipboard." The crowd did not react with noise. It reacted with the opposite of noise, a compression of silence so complete that the wind moving through the distant grass at the 500-yard mark was audible. Nash Holloway's mouth was open slightly. The attorney had stopped walking. Wyatt Mercer, standing 4 feet from Nash, was looking at the ground. Silas had not moved at the bench. He was looking at Hank Yardley, and if there was something moving through him. At the revelation that the 22-year-old spotter from that ridge in February of 1952 had been standing 12 feet away from him. All morning his face did not broadcast it in any way that the crowd could read. What his face showed was the particular composure of a man receiving information he has been prepared for by decades of keeping his own counsel. He looked at Hank for a long moment. Then he said quietly, so that only Hank and the 2 or 3 people closest to the bench could hear, "I looked for your name in 1958. They told me the unit records were incomplete." Hank Yardley closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and nodded once the way men nod when words would be accurate but insufficient. Raymond Thatch had been standing at the edge of this scene for the past 4 minutes without moving. He had not moved toward Nash, and he had not moved toward the firing line. He had stood at the angle he had stopped at when he first heard Hank Yardley begin speaking, and he had listened to every word with the quality of attention he reserved for information that was reorganizing something in him. He had 30 years of military service. He had attended a great number of ceremonies in that time, and he had delivered a great number of remarks at a great number of occasions designed to honor a great number of men. He had done it with sincerity mostly, and with the specific fluency of someone who has learned the language of recognition so thoroughly that it no longer requires preparation. What he was watching now was not a ceremony. It was something that did not have a category in the language he had learned. because it had not been designed, and it had not been prepared, and no one had briefed him on it, and nothing about it was performing itself for his benefit or anyone else's. It was simply two men, both of them old standing on Montana grass, with 46 years of something unresolved between them, and one of them had just said, "I look for your name," and the other one had just closed his eyes for 1 second. Thatch turned to Nash Holloway. He said quietly, "We're not doing the signing today." Nash looked at him. Thatch said, "Reschedule it. Call my office Monday." Nash opened his mouth and closed it again. Thatch was already walking, not toward his car, toward the firing line. He walked through the crowd the way senior officers move through groups of people, not aggressively, but with a directionality that causes people to step aside, without being asked an accumulated authority that has nothing to do with the absence of uniform, because authority of that kind does not live in cloth. People stepped aside. The crowd parted in front of him by small degrees until he was standing at the rope barrier. He stood there for a moment looking at the two men at the bench. Then he ducked under the rope and walked onto the firing line. Hank Yardley saw him coming and straightened slightly. An involuntary postural adjustment, the kind that certain kinds of training put into a man's spine permanently. Thatch stopped in front of Silas Croft. He looked at him for a moment with the steady assessment of a man who has learned to look at men rather than through them. He took in the flannel shirt and the scuffed boots and the canvas bag at his feet and the borrowed rifle on the bench and the paper number 64 still folded in the breast pocket. Then Raymond Thatch raised his right hand to his brow. It was a precise salute, the kind that does not require a uniform to be valid. The kind that is offered not to rank, but to something older and less official than rank, to the specific quality of service rendered in circumstances that rank does not fully cover. He held it. Silas Croft returned it. His arm came up with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the trembling in the restroom 30 minutes ago. His hand was level and his eyes were level. And the salute he returned was the salute of a man who has earned the right to receive one without embarrassment or deflection. The crowd was absolutely silent. Thatch lowered his hand. He turned to face the people behind the rope, and the motion of it was not theatrical, but it was deliberate, the turn of a man who has something to say and is choosing the direction from which to say it. This man, he set his voice carrying across the grounds, with the ease of someone who has addressed formations in open air for 3 decades, made a shot this morning that I understand 63 trained precision shooters were unable to make. I was not here for that shot, but I was here for what came after it. And I can tell you that what I have just heard described by the range officer standing behind me is consistent with a category of marksmanship that is not developed by competition. It is developed by necessity, and the distinction matters. He paused. I have spent 30 years in the United States Army, he said. I have signed commendations and medals and citations for acts of valor in conditions that are difficult to convey to people who were not present for them. I have learned over those 30 years that the men who perform those acts are very rarely the men who announce themselves when they walk into a room. They are almost always the men you do not notice until the moment you cannot ignore them. He looked at Nash Holloway across the crowd. Whatever administrative question exists about this man's equipment, he said, I would encourage you to resolve it in the manner that is correct, rather than the manner that is convenient. These are not always the same thing. In my experience, the gap between them tends to widen over time until it becomes very difficult to cross. Nash Holloway had the particular expression of a man whose morning has departed so far from its planned itinerary that he is no longer sure what category of problem he is managing. The attorney beside him had stopped moving his pen. The crowd behind the rope was 3 people deep and growing, and the phones that had been raised to record the shot were still raised, which meant that whatever happened next was going to be recorded by 20 or 30 people simultaneously, a fact that was not lost on Nash. He looked at his attorney. The attorney said very quietly that in his interpretation, the competitor rules as written did not actually prohibit borrowed equipment. He said he should have flagged the ambiguity earlier, and that the clause as drafted addressed technical specifications rather than ownership. He said this with the expression of a man accepting a small professional embarrassment in the service of a larger correctness. Nash looked at the crowd. He looked at Wyatt Mercer, who was watching him with an expression that was not hostile but was not patient either. The expression of a young man who has made a decision about which side of something he is on and is waiting to see whether that decision is going to cost him anything. He looked at the acrylic case on the judge's table with the $15,000 inside it. He walked to the table. He picked up the case. He walked to the firing line and he stood in front of Silas Croft, and he opened the case and he held it out. The check was already written. It had been written on the first morning of the event as a prop, a visual element, something to photograph and post on the event website, under the heading "The Prize That Changed Everything," a phrase Nash had drafted himself without expecting it to become accurate. Silas looked at the check. He looked at it the way he had looked at the white plate at 1,000 yards, with the full, steady attention of a man who does not require other people to confirm what he is seeing. Then he reached out and took it. He folded it once lengthwise with the same deliberate care he had used on the number 64 3 hours earlier, and he slid it into his breast pocket next to his father's watch and the confirmation postcard from 2 weeks ago. The pocket was getting full, which struck him as appropriate. He extended his hand to Nash Holloway. Nash shook it. The handshake was correct on Silas's side and effortful on Nash's, and the crowd could see the difference, which was perhaps the most honest thing that had happened between the two of them all morning. The applause that followed was not the burst of the immediate reaction after the shot. It was slower and more sustained, the kind that builds from the back of a crowd as the people farthest away understand what has happened and add their voices to it. It was the applause of people who have seen something resolved correctly and are expressing their relief as much as their approval. Silas did not turn to receive it. He looked at Hank Yardley. The 2 men stood on the firing line with the noise of the crowd behind them and the long, flat reach of Montana field in front of them, and the white plate at 1,000 yards still visible in the September morning. Unremarkable now, just a piece of metal on a post in the grass. "How long?" Silas said. Hank understood the question. He said, 46 years. I was at the VA in Billings for a while after I got back. Then I was in Missoula. I tried the records office in 1961 and again in 1971. The unit records from that period had gaps. His voice was even and precise, the voice of a man reporting facts, rather than grieving them, which was its own kind of grief. Silas nodded slowly. "You did your job," Silas said. "That morning, you read the wind exactly right." Hank said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You made the shot." Silas said, "You gave me what I needed to make it." This was, between the two of them, a complete summary of something that had taken 46 years to say, and they both understood it as such. And neither of them felt the need to add to it. Raymond Thatch had stepped back to give them space. He stood a few yards off with his hands at his sides, watching them the way a man watches something that does not need him to be useful, but that he does not want to look away from either. He had canceled his morning's business, and he found that he did not regret it. He had been to a great many events and signed a great many checks and given a great many remarks at occasions designed to feel significant, and very few of them had left him standing quietly in a field afterward, not ready to leave. The crowd at the rope had not entirely dispersed. Many of the people who had been there for the shot had stayed, and others had joined them, drawn by the acoustic signature of something genuine, which is different from the acoustic signature of entertainment in ways that are difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable. Several of the older men who had stood with their arms folded before the shot were now standing with their arms at their sides, which was the postural equivalent of a significant revision. Wyatt Mercer had not left. He was standing at the rope barrier, not watching the crowd, and not watching Thatch, and not watching Nash Holloway, who had retreated toward the judge's tent with the expression of a man recalibrating a great many things simultaneously. Wyatt was watching Silas. He had been watching Silas since the salute with an attention that was different from the attention of that morning. The attention of that morning had been the attention of a competitor assessing a rival and finding him wanting. This was a different kind of looking entirely, and if you had pressed Wyatt Mercer to name it, he would not have been able to, which was precisely why it was genuine. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. He had made a decision in the 60 seconds after Hank Yardley finished speaking. A decision that had been forming, he understood now, for 3 years. 3 years of looking at a name in a will and searching county records and driving out to rural addresses that turned out to be wrong, and beginning to believe that the thing he had been asked to do was simply not possible in the time frame given. 3 years of carrying something that did not belong to him and not knowing how to put it down. He knew now. He stayed at the rope and waited with the patience of a man who has learned late, but not too late, that some conversations cannot be rushed toward. Silas had shaken Hank Yardley's hand again, and they had exchanged a few more words in the low, measured tone of men who have just made a first payment on a very long debt and understand that the full accounting will take more time than the rest of the morning. Silas had agreed to give Hank his phone number, which was the first time in 2 years he had voluntarily given his phone number to anyone other than Sadie. He had written it on the back of the confirmation postcard with the pen Hank produced, and he had handed it over with the deliberateness of a man making a formal commitment. Then he picked up his canvas bag. He walked toward the rope because his truck was on the other side of it, and the crowd opened for him, the way crowds open when they are no longer watching a spectacle but are in the presence of something else. People stepped aside without being asked. A few of them said things to him as he passed, brief things, the kinds of things people say at the edges of significant moments when they want to acknowledge what they have seen without inflating it. He nodded to each of them without stopping. He reached the rope barrier. Wyatt Mercer was standing 6 feet to the left of the opening. Silas stopped. He looked at Wyatt the way he had looked at him from the registration table that morning, with the full neutral attention of a man who has registered a thing and reserved judgment on it. He waited. Wyatt Mercer had practiced in some version what he was going to say when he found Silas Croft. He had practiced it in his truck on the way to addresses that turned out to be wrong, and he had practiced it in his head during the long intervals between searches, and none of the practiced versions were available to him now. What came out instead was the unedited version. "I owe you an apology for this morning," Wyatt said. "That was wrong of me." Silas looked at him. "I also," Wyatt said, and here his voice changed slightly, not breaking but shifting in register, the way voices shift when the thing being said has weight that the speaker has been managing for a long time. "I have something of yours, or something that should be yours. I've been looking for you for 3 years. Silas did not respond. He waited. Wyatt reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. It was a standard legal envelope, white with a law firm's return address in Bozeman in the upper left corner. It had been opened once along the top and carefully resealed with a strip of tape. My grandfather's name was Clifford Mercer, Wyatt said. He died in 1995. His will included a provision that I didn't understand when I first read it. A property deed for 40 acres in Gallatin County held in trust. The instruction was to find the family of a man named Silas Croft and return it to them within 5 years of the reading of the will. This is year 3. Silas looked at the envelope. Wyatt said, in 1951, when you were overseas, my grandfather purchased that land from your wife for $800. He knew it was worth more. He knew she had no choice. He made the transaction legal, but he spent the rest of his life knowing it was not right. He never told anyone. When he died, there was 1 page in his personal papers that explained it. Just 1 page. It said that the land did not belong to him. It said it was a debt, not an inheritance. Silas was very still. He was thinking about Pearl in the winter of 1951, alone in the house with a child who was not yet 1 year old. The mortgage on a payment schedule that assumed 2 incomes. The fields empty, no word on when or whether he was coming back from a peninsula. That the newspapers were not making sound. Optimistic. He had come back. He had come back, and Pearl had been at the door when he got there. And she had not told him about the land for 2 months. And when she finally told him, she had said only that she had done what she had to do, and that it was done, and they were not going to spend their lives looking back at it. They had not looked back at it. For 47 years, they had not looked back at it. He reached out and took the envelope from Wyatt Mercer's hand. He did not open it. He held it flat across his palm and looked at it for a moment. And the look on his face was not triumphant, and it was not grieving, and it was not the look of a man who has been vindicated after a long wait. It was quieter than any of those things. It was the look of a man who has just received something that changes the shape of a story he thought was already finished. He looked up at Wyatt. Your grandfather, Silas, said kept the records. Wyatt said he kept everything. The original deed, the correspondence with the bank, the payment receipts. Everything is in that envelope. Silas looked at the envelope again. Then he said, this morning was a mistake. Wyatt said quietly, yes. And it wasn't about me. Silas said. Was it? It was not a question. It was the observation of a man who has just understood something that explains a thing that needed explaining. The aggressive loudness of that morning at the registration table. The immediate and disproportionate reversal at the rope line when the equipment clause was invoked. These were not the behaviors of a young competitor managing an unexpected outcome. They were the behaviors of a man who recognized a name and did not know what to do with that recognition, and made a series of poor decisions in quick succession while he figured it out. Wyatt did not answer. The answer was already understood by both of them. Silas put the envelope in his breast pocket. It joined the folded check in his father's watch and the confirmation postcard from 2 weeks ago, and the number 64. And the pocket was now carrying considerably more than flannel was designed to manage, which did not bother him in the least. He extended his hand to Wyatt Mercer. Wyatt took it. The handshake was brief and level. The handshake of 2 men who have arrived at a resolution that is honest if not comfortable, which is the best kind of resolution. No warmth yet, but no performance either. Just 2 men on Montana grass, acknowledging that something has been transacted between them and that the transaction is for now complete. Silas nodded once, Then he picked up his canvas bag and walked through the gap in the rope barrier and across the parking lot toward the far end, where the 1987 Ford was parked close to the fence post that leaned slightly north. The crowd watched him go. Thatch watched him go. Hank Yardley watched him go with the expression of a man who has waited 46 years for something and has finally received it, and is now in the strange quiet territory of after where the waiting is done and the receiving is done. And what remains is simply the fact of the thing which is both less and more than the waiting had made it. Wyatt Mercer watched him go with both hands at his sides, and his face composed into something that was not quite peace and not quite relief, but was moving in the direction of both. Nash Holloway watched him go from the shade of the judge's tent and did not say anything to anyone for a long time. Silas reached his truck. He put the canvas bag with the borrowed Remington into the bed, carefully, the way you put someone else's property down when you intend to return it intact. He opened the driver's door. He got in. He sat for a moment in the cab with the door closed and both hands on the steering wheel, the same position he had been in when the morning began, and he looked out through the cracked left headlight at the parking lot and the vendor tents and the crowd that was slowly beginning to disperse. He reached for the thermos on the dashboard. He drank one slow mouthful of black coffee. In his breast pocket against his chest were 4 things: a check for $15,000, an envelope containing the deed to 40 acres his wife had sold out of necessity in the winter of 1951, when he was not there to prevent it, a Hamilton watch from 1941 with a cracked crystal, and a confirmation postcard from 2 weeks ago that had started all of this. He set the thermos back on the dashboard. The September sun was high now, and the shadow of the fence post fell across the hood of the truck in a long, thin line, and across the grounds the PA system was beginning to announce the afternoon sessions. A voice describing ballistics and wind drift and the mathematics of precision, shooting in the bright and practiced tone of a man explaining things that have been reduced to instruction. Silas put the key in the ignition. He was about to turn it when he heard a car pull into the lot behind him, moving fast, the wheels throwing gravel, and he looked in the rearview mirror and watched a silver Subaru pull into the nearest open space and come to a stop with the kind of urgency that means the driver has been on the highway for a while and has arrived exactly as late as they feared they would. He watched the door open. He watched Sadie get out. She was wearing the blue jacket she wore on weekday mornings when she was going somewhere she considered professional, which told him she had not planned this trip, had not dressed for it, had simply gotten in the car when she heard something and driven. Her hair was not the way she usually wore it when she was prepared for the day. She was looking across the lot, scanning, and then she found his truck, and she walked toward it. And he could see, even from across the parking lot, even through a cracked windshield held together by familiar habit, that her face was doing something it did not usually do in front of him. He watched her come. He had not told her he was coming here today. He had not told her what was in his breast pocket. He had not told her about the 3 months of missed payments he knew about, and she thought he did not know about. He had not told her a great many things because Silas Croft had spent 69 years believing that the things a man does not say are often more important than the things he does, and that certain preparations are more honest when made in silence than when announced. Sadie reached the truck and stopped beside the driver's window. He rolled it down. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment, the way you say nothing when you have driven 3 hours on the information that your father has done something that the Bozeman radio station apparently considered worth interrupting its regular programming to describe. And you are still deciding whether to lead with relief or exasperation or something else that does not have a simple name. She said, finally, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm all right." She said the radio said 1,000 yards. He said, "That's right." She looked at him. He reached into his breast pocket and he took out the folded check and he handed it through the window. Sadie took it. She unfolded it. She looked at it for a long moment and Silas watched her face go through several things in rapid succession. The arithmetic first, and then the recognition of what the arithmetic meant, and then something softer and more complicated underneath that. The something that happens when a person realizes that the help they have been too proud to ask for has been arranged without requiring them to ask. She looked up at him. He said, "I need you to drive me back. I want to return Dale's rifle in person." Sadie folded the check once and held it in both hands and looked at her father through the open window of the truck he had driven to the far end of a parking lot and sat in alone for 10 minutes before making a decision that had been 46 years in preparation, and she said in a voice that was completely level, "All right." Then she walked around to the passenger side and got in. The door closed. The Ford sat in the September sun at the far end of the Gallatin County Fairgrounds lot, close to a fence post that leaned slightly north, while across the grounds the PA system continued its afternoon announcements, and the vendor tents caught the light, and the long field stretched out to the south with the steel plate still standing at 1,000 yards exactly where it had been small and white, and waiting for nothing in particular. Now that the morning was over, and the thing that needed doing had been done, they drove north on State Highway 2, with the windows up against the October chill that had moved into the September afternoon without much announcement, the way weather moves in Montana decisively, and without apology. Sadie drove. She had taken the keys from Silas without asking, and he had let her, which was a form of communication between them that required no translation. The silver Subaru handled the highway with the quiet competence of a car that has been maintained by someone who cannot afford for it not to be. Sadie kept both hands on the wheel at the 9 and 3 positions the way she had learned to drive, and had never stopped a habit she was not aware of, and that Silas had always found quietly reassuring. The borrowed rifle was in the bed of the Ford, which Sadie was towing behind them on a ball hitch that Silas had installed himself 12 years ago, and that had never given either of them any trouble. The fairgrounds fell away behind them. The field with the white plate at 1,000 yards was not visible from the highway, but Silas knew which direction it was, in the way you know the direction of things that have been significant. A permanent addition to the internal map that accumulates over a lifetime and has very little to do with geography. They did not speak for the first several miles. This was not an uncomfortable silence. Between Silas and Sadie, silence had always been a working medium rather than an absence, a shared space in which things that didn't need words were allowed to simply exist. Pearl had been the one who filled silences in the house not out of discomfort, but out of a particular quality of presence that made the rooms feel inhabited in a way that was distinct from the mere physical occupation of them. After Pearl was gone, the silences had changed character. They were the same silences in the same rooms, but they held a different weight now, the weight of one person rather than 3. Sadie said eventually, without taking her eyes off the road, "How long have you been planning this?" Silas considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. 4 weeks, he said, "since I read the notice in the Chronicle." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should have told me." He said you would have tried to talk me out of it. She said yes. He said that's why I didn't tell you. Another mile of highway past the landscape opening out to the east in the long rolling way of Montana distances that always made Silas feel that the world was larger and more patient than the daily management of it suggested. Sadie said the radio said a retired general gave a speech. Silas said he did. She said about you. He said about the shot. They're different things. Sadie glanced at him briefly and then looked back at the road. He could see in the quarter second of that glance that she was deciding how much to pursue and how much to leave in the working silence where it was already sitting comfortably. She was her mother's daughter in many ways, and one of the most significant of those ways was that she understood the difference between information that needed to be extracted and information that would arrive when it was ready. She let it sit. After a while, Silas reached into his breast pocket, not for the check or the envelope or the watch, but for the confirmation postcard, and he held it in both hands on his knees. It was a standard postcard, the kind printed in bulk with the event logo at the top, and his name and registration number typed in the middle, and a brief confirmation of the rules at the bottom, in the small font of documents that assume you will not read them carefully. He had read it carefully. He had read it the night it arrived and then put it in his shirt pocket and carried it every day for 2 weeks. He was not sure exactly why. It was not a sentimental document. It was not a letter from anyone who knew him or cared about the outcome. It was an administrative confirmation from a sporting event in Gallatin County, but it was also in the specific way of small, tangible objects, a commitment that had been made real by its physical presence. And Silas had learned a long time ago that the physicality of a commitment matters, that keeping the object of a decision close to your body is a way of keeping the decision itself honest. He put the postcard back in his pocket. They reached Dale Pruitt's house at 2:15. It was a low ranch house set back from a county road, white with green shutters, with a yard that was meticulously maintained in the particular way of retired men who have redirected 30 years of professional precision into the management of grass and flower beds. Dale's truck was in the driveway, which meant Dale was home, which Silas had expected, because Dale was almost always home. Silas got out and took the rifle case from the bed of the Ford and walked to the front door. He knocked twice. Dale came to the door in a flannel shirt that was the same weight as Silas's, but red rather than green. He was 71 years old, a retired high school history teacher who had moved to Montana 30 years ago from Indiana, for reasons he had explained to Silas once in a long evening conversation that covered a great deal of ground, not all of it comfortable. He had a face that was naturally organized for amiability, the kind of face that has spent 7 decades defaulting to openness and has the lines to show for it. He looked at Silas. He looked at the rifle case. He looked past Silas at the silver Subaru idling in the driveway with Sadie behind the wheel. He said, "Well." Silas held out the rifle case. He said, "Thank you for the loan, Dale. I took good care of it." Dale took the case and held it at his side without opening it. He said, "I heard on the radio." Silas said it was a good morning. Dale looked at him for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who has something he wants to say and is calculating how much of it is actually necessary. He said Pearl would have been impossible to live with after this. She would have been insufferable. For months. Silas said yes, she would have. Dale nodded. He said, "Come in for coffee." Silas said, "I appreciate it. Another time." He shook Dale's hand. Dale gripped it with both of his and held it for a moment, and then let go, and Silas turned and walked back to the Subaru. He got in. Sadie put the car in reverse. They drove the remaining 12 miles to the house in the same working silence. And when they turned onto the gravel drive that Pearl had planted with juniper on both sides in 1979, and that were now substantially larger than Pearl had anticipated, Silas felt the particular sensation he always felt on this drive, the sensation of returning to something. The recognition that comes not from familiarity alone, but from attachment, from the specific relationship between a person and a place that accumulates over decades, until the place is no longer simply where you live, but where you are. Sadie pulled up to the house and stopped. It was a single-story house with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. A house that had been built without ambition but with care. The kind of house that looks better at 50 years old than it did at 20, because the trees have grown in around it, and the lines have softened, and the whole thing has settled into its landscape with the permanence of something that intends to stay. The workshop was visible behind it, a low, separate building with a corrugated metal roof that Silas had re-roofed himself 8 years ago, on a long weekend in August that had left him unable to fully straighten his back for a week. They sat in the car for a moment. Sadie reached into the back seat and picked up her bag, the large canvas tote she used as a combination briefcase, an everyday bag, and she reached into it and took out an envelope and held it in her lap. Silas looked at it. It was an envelope he recognized, or rather, he recognized the handwriting on the front of it. He would have recognized it anywhere on any surface in any quality of light, because it was the handwriting that had addressed birthday cards and grocery lists, and the occasional letter tucked into his lunch bag. In the early years, a handwriting that was precise and slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught penmanship in a manner that took the subject seriously, and had never seen reason to abandon what she had been carefully taught. His name was on the front of it. Just his name, no address, the way you address something that you intend to hand to a person, rather than mail to a location. Sadie said she gave this to me in February of 1996, the week she came home from the hospital the second time. She told me to give it to you when you finally left the workshop. Silas looked at the envelope in Sadie's hands. He said, "What do you mean when I finally left the workshop?" Sadie said she said, and I'm going to tell you exactly what she said, because she made me repeat it back to her twice to make sure I had it right. She said, "Give this to your father when he finally decides to come back out into the world." She said you would know when that was, and I would know when that was, and that the envelope would keep until then. Silas was very still. He said she knew I would stop going out. Sadie said she knew you is what she knew. He looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it from Sadie's hands. It was lighter than he expected, which meant it was not a long letter, which was consistent with Pearl, who had always communicated more in fewer words than most people managed in many. He said, "Give me a little while." Sadie said, "I'll start something for dinner." She got out of the car and went inside, and the screen door made its particular sound. The sound it had made for 30 years, since he had installed the spring wrong, and then decided after several days that he preferred the sound to the effort of correcting it. Silas sat in the Subaru in the driveway with the envelope in his hands, and the September sun coming through the windshield at the angle of mid-afternoon, and the junipers on both sides of the drive casting their thin shadows across the gravel. He opened the envelope. There were 2 pages inside folded once. He unfolded them and held them flat against his knees and read. Pearl's handwriting was as he remembered it, the slight forward lean, the deliberate spacing between words. The particular way she formed the letter S that he had watched her make 10,000 times on 10,000 surfaces. Reading it was like hearing her voice in the specific register she used when she was saying something she had decided needed to be said with care. A register slightly lower than her everyday voice, quieter and more deliberate. She had written, "Silas, by the time Sadie gives you this, you will have done whatever it is that got you back out there. And I am glad of it, even though I am not there to see it. I know you will think I arranged something or pushed something into motion, and I want you to know I did not. What I did was know you. What I know is that you have been keeping very still for a long time, longer than is good for you, and that the stillness is not rest. It is waiting. You are waiting for something to tell you that it is still all right to be what you are. He stopped reading. He looked out through the windshield at the junipers. One of them needed trimming on the left side where a branch had grown out toward the drive. He had been meaning to trim it for 2 months. He returned to the letter. Pearl had written, "I want you to hear this from me and not from anyone else. What you did over there, the thing you have never fully told me, but that I have known the shape of for 40 years, is not a thing that belongs only to that time and that place. It is a thing that belongs to you. It is part of what you are, and it does not go away when the occasion for it goes away. I have watched you be careful with it for decades, and I understand the carefulness, and I am not asking you to be careless. I am asking you to remember that a thing kept too carefully, for too long, becomes a thing kept from the world rather than protected for it. And there is a difference." He read the paragraph again. He had read a lot of things in 69 years. He had read field manuals and maintenance schedules and loan documents and obituaries and the Chronicle every morning for 40 years. He had read the letter Dale had sent when his wife passed, which was the most honest letter he had ever received from another man. He was not a man who was easily moved by words on a page, having lived long enough to understand that words on a page are frequently aspirational rather than accurate. These words were accurate. He knew they were accurate because they described something he had been unable to describe himself, and had not been aware that anyone else had seen clearly enough to describe. The stillness that is not rest. He had told himself for 2 years that he was simply adjusting. He had told himself that the workshop was not avoidance, but preference, that the thermos and the saddle leather and the narrow, manageable world of repair were a reasonable way to spend the years that remained. He had believed this well enough to function on it. Pearl had seen through it the way Pearl had always seen through things. Not with the aggression of someone who needs to be right, but with the patience of someone who is willing to wait for you to catch up. He continued reading. She had written, "Sadie needs you present, Silas, not physically, because you have always been physically present, and she knows that. She needs to see you decide that the world outside the workshop is worth showing up for. Not for her sake, though it would be for her sake. For yours. Children of any age need to see their parents choose to live. It is a thing you teach by doing it, not by explaining it. And then I am not afraid for you. I want to say that plainly. I am not afraid for you because I know you, and because what I know is sufficient. You will find your way back out. You always have. I have watched you find your way out of things that were considerably more difficult than grief, and I know you do not like me saying that. But I am saying it anyway because I'm not there to argue with you about it, and you will have to let it stand." He smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, the smile of a man ambushed by accuracy. She had written one more thing. The 40 acres. I know you know about the 40 acres. I know you have known since 1953 when you came back and found the land records and counted the acreage and did not say anything because you decided we were not going to spend our lives looking backward at it. I want you to know that I have never regretted that decision. What I want you to know, and what I could not figure out how to say while I was still alive, and you were still in the same room with me, because you would have argued with me about it, is that the 40 acres was not a defeat. It was a cost. We paid it. It is paid. A cost is not a defeat. I need you to understand the difference before I am comfortable leaving. He lowered the pages to his knees, Outside the windshield, the September light was moving through its afternoon progression, the shadows of the junipers lengthening across the gravel, the workshop roof catching the sun at the angle that made the corrugated metal look briefly for about 20 minutes each afternoon at this time of year, like hammered copper. He had not known until this moment that Pearl knew about the land records. He had assumed his silence on the subject was adequate. He had counted the acres in 1953 and done the arithmetic on what they were worth, and looked at Pearl across the kitchen table and made the decision not to revisit it. And he had believed until this afternoon that the decision was mutual, because it was mutual, and the subject had never come up. Pearl had known. She had known, and she had let him believe the silence was shared rather than directed, which was a specific and considerable act of grace that he was only now, 45 years later, in a full position to appreciate. He read the last paragraph. She had written, "I married a man who is better at the things that matter than he knows which is the best kind of man to marry. What you have been given is not a burden to manage quietly. It is a thing to use." I believe this completely. I have believed it our entire marriage. I am asking you in this letter, on whatever morning Sadie gives it to you, to believe it also. Not for me. I am past the point where you can do things for me, for whatever is in front of you still, which is more than you think. Then her name, the way she signed things that were meant to last, not the informal Pearl of grocery lists and quick notes, but the full name Pearl Ann Croft, with the date below it. February 19th, 1996. She had written it 14 months before she died. She had written it knowing she might not see the spring. He held the 2 pages in his hands and looked at her name at the bottom of the second page, and he felt in the quiet of the Subaru, with the afternoon moving across the windshield, and the workshop roof going its brief copper color in the east, something that was not grief exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but was made from the same materials as both of those things, and had been assembled by someone with more patience and more care than either of those categories usually received. He had loved Pearl Croft for 44 years. He had loved her with the specific and somewhat inarticulate love of a man who is better at demonstrating things than explaining them, who shows up and stays and maintains and repairs and endures and considers all of that to be a sufficient language. He had thought on most days of their marriage that he understood the full shape of what he had in her. He had been wrong in the way that you are wrong about something you value highly, which is that you understand its worth but underestimate its depth. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. It joined the other things there. The pocket was now carrying everything that had happened today, and he was aware, sitting in the Subaru in the drive of the house where 44 years of his life had taken place, that this was not a weight he wanted to put down. He got out of the car. He walked to the front porch and sat in the chair on the right side of the door. The chair he had always sat in, because Pearl had always sat in the left one, and the arrangement had established itself in the first year of their marriage and had never been revisited. The left chair was still there. It had been there empty for 2 years and 4 months, and he had not moved it, and Sadie had not moved it. And it sat in its position with the same reliability as everything else Pearl had arranged, and that had outlasted her. He sat and he looked at the drive and the junipers and the county road beyond them, and the fields past that rolling north under the afternoon sky with the particular beauty of Montana in September. A beauty that does not announce itself or compete for your attention, but simply exists with the confidence of something that has been here longer than anyone watching it and intends to remain. From inside the house came the sound of Sadie moving in the kitchen, the low sound of a cabinet opening, the particular note of the burner on the stove, when it catches a sound he had been hearing for 38 years. because Sadie had grown up in this kitchen and had learned its sounds and had retained them with the unconscious fidelity of someone who doesn't know they are memorizing. Hank Yardley had looked for him for 46 years. He let that settle fully for the first time now that the afternoon had provided the appropriate quiet for it. 46 years. From 1952 to 1998, Hank Yardley had carried the name of his spotter and the memory of a ridge, and the unfinished business of having been saved by someone he had never been able to properly account for. And he had gone on living his life in the manner that men do, who carry such things, which is to say, fully and with apparent normalcy, and with the particular quality of attention that comes from understanding that life is not guaranteed and every day of it is already more than was technically required. Silas had carried his own version of the same account. He had carried the spotter, the young man whose voice in his ear had been as steady as the mathematics it was delivering, who had read the wind off a piece of cloth and given him the numbers and trusted the outcome to the man with the rifle. He had carried that voice for 46 years without a name attached to it, because the unit records were incomplete, and because Silas was not by nature a man who pursued the closing of accounts that the world had decided were closed. Today the account had closed itself, which he recognized as the kind of thing that happens when you stop trying to arrange the world and simply show up in it. He sat on the porch until the shadow of the workshop reached the far edge of the drive, which was the signal his body had learned over decades to associate with the hour before dinner. Then he went inside. The kitchen smelled of something with onion and the low, sustained heat of a pot that has been going for a while, a smell he associated with every good evening of the last 40 years. Sadie was at the counter with her back to him, her sleeves rolled up, working with the economy of motion of a person who has been cooking in this kitchen since she was old enough to reach the counter. She heard him come in and said without turning, "Sit down." He sat at the table, the chair closest to the window. His chair. The chair whose legs had been replaced twice, and whose seat he had regained himself in 1991 in a weekend project that had taken considerably longer than he estimated, and produced a result that he considered satisfactory, and Pearl had considered beautiful. He set the letter on the table beside the thermos. Sadie brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. She looked at the letter. She said she told me it was for you and I was not to read it. Silas said that would be consistent. Sadie said, "What did it say?" And then immediately, "You don't have to tell me." He thought about how to answer. He said she said the 40 acres was a cost, not a defeat. Sadie looked at him. She said, "The Mercer land." He took the envelope from his breast pocket and set it on the table between them. Sadie looked at it. He told her what Wyatt had told him plainly, and without elaboration, the way he told things. The will. Clifford Mercer. The debt acknowledged and carried for decades and finally addressed in the only way available to a man who had waited too long to address it in person. Sadie listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had from him rather than from Pearl. Pearl having been constitutionally unable to let a story arrive at its own pace. When he finished, she looked at the envelope for a moment. She said 40 acres. He said in Gallatin County. She said we don't know what shape it's in. He said no. She said it could be overgrown. He said likely. She picked up her coffee. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she arranged this, didn't she? Mom. She knew about the Mercers. She knew you would eventually come to something like this. That's what the letter was. Silas said she didn't arrange it. She said so explicitly in the letter. And I believe her. Sadie said, "Then how do you explain it?" He thought about this carefully. because it deserved careful thought. He said she knew me well enough to know that I would eventually do something worth doing. She didn't know what. She just knew she wanted to be there for it in the way she could be. Sadie looked at the letter on the table. She said quietly, "That is the most her thing I have ever heard." They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the two of them, with the evening coming down outside the window, over the sink in the kitchen, filling with the particular kind of warmth that a stove provides when the temperature outside is dropping. They talked about the event more than Silas usually talked about anything, because Sadie had questions and Silas found that the questions did not feel intrusive tonight, that the morning had opened something in him that was not yet closed again, and that answered willingly. She asked about Hank Yardley. He told her what he could. Korea, 1952, the ridge, the shot, the unit records. He told her that Hank had been 22 years old, that he had read the wind correctly, and delivered the numbers clearly under conditions that would have excused a great deal of inaccuracy. He told her that he had looked for Hank's name in 1958 through the records office in Denver, and been told the records for that unit were incomplete, which was the period in American military history when a great deal of things were called incomplete that were not incomplete so much as inadequately maintained. Sadie said, "Are you going to stay in contact with him?" Silas said, "I gave him my phone number." Sadie looked at him with the expression of a person who is registering the significance of information in proportion to what they know about the person delivering it. She said, "You gave him your phone number?" He said yes. She said, "You haven't given anyone your phone number in 2 years." He said 2 years and 4 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." After dinner, he washed the dishes because it was his turn, and the turn had not changed because the morning had been unusual. Sadie dried. They worked in the companionable parallel of people who have done a thing together enough times that the doing of it is a form of conversation in itself. When the dishes were done, Sadie made more coffee, and they sat at the table again, and she told him about a bookkeeping client who was expanding into a second location and needed help restructuring the accounts, and he listened with the full attention. He gave things that mattered to Sadie, which was all things that mattered to Sadie. He did not mention the check. She did not mention the check. The check was understood between them as a thing that would be handled in the manner of practical matters, which was to say it would be deposited and applied to what it needed to be applied to, and the application would not be discussed at length, because length was not required. Silas had learned this economy from his own parents, and had practiced it all his life, and had found it to be both functional and, in its way, a form of respect. The refusal to inflate the drama of assistance between people who love each other, beyond the drama that the assistance itself actually carries. Before he went to his room that night, he stood on the front porch for a few minutes in the dark. The temperature had dropped to the upper 30s, and the sky was clear in the way of Montana nights in September. The stars arranged without any consideration for human preferences about quantity or brightness. He had stood on this porch thousands of times in this approximate posture, in this approximate quality of night, and it had been on most of those occasions simply the last thing of the day, the natural terminus of an evening. Tonight it felt like a different category of standing. He looked at the empty left chair. He said not loudly in the voice he used in the workshop when he was talking through a problem with a piece of leather, or a stuck fastening, the voice of a man addressing something that cannot respond but is fully present. She was right about the cost. You were right. I understand it now. The junipers were dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky. The county road was empty. Somewhere to the north, a dog announced itself once and then was quiet. He went inside and closed the door behind him. In the months that followed, things changed in the way things change when a single morning has been sufficient to reroute the direction of travel. The changes were not dramatic. They were the changes of a man who has decided in the private and binding way of decisions made without witnesses to apply what he has always been to the days that remain. He called Hank Yardley the following Tuesday. Hank answered on the second ring, which suggested that Hank had been expecting the call and had stationed himself accordingly. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes, which was longer than Silas had talked on the phone to anyone other than Sadie in several years. They covered the ridge eventually because it needed to be covered, and covering it took less time and less pain than either of them had separately anticipated, because the other person in the conversation already knew what had happened and did not require the construction of context. They covered their lives since more briefly because the interval was long and had been lived, and summarized versions of lived intervals have a tendency toward the misleadingly simple. They agreed to talk again. They talked again. They talked with the regularity of men who have discovered late in life that the friendship they should have had for 46 years is still entirely available, only compressed. And that compression of this kind produces a particular quality of conversation efficient and honest and stripped of the social maintenance that friendships conducted in real time require. Hank drove out in November, and Silas met him in the driveway, and they shook hands and then went into the workshop, because the workshop was where Silas did things that mattered to him, and Hank understood this without being told. Hank sat on the stool by the door, and Silas worked on a bridle that was giving him trouble at the bit connector while they talked, and the talking was the kind that does not require either party to sit still for it. Sadie made dinner. It was the first time in 2 years that there had been a guest at the kitchen table, and she made a thing with chicken that Pearl had made for guests, and that Silas had not eaten since the last time Pearl had made it, which had been 6 years ago, before the illness made cooking difficult. And the eating of it was a more complicated experience than it appeared from the outside. Hank noticed his face and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. The deed to the Gallatin County land was filed with the county recorder's office in October by the law firm whose return address appeared on the envelope. The 40 acres were, as Sadie had predicted, substantially overgrown, having sat unused since Clifford Mercer had acquired it in 1951 and declined to develop it for reasons that were now apparent. The land itself was not exceptional, except that it was land and it was theirs, and the word theirs had a weight to it that could not be measured by the acreage or the assessed value on the county record. Silas drove out to it alone on a Tuesday morning in October, the day after the deed was filed. He parked at the edge of the county road and walked the property line in the way Pearl had described his father once walking a property line, with both hands loose at his sides, and his attention spread out rather than focused. The overgrowth was juniper and some young cottonwood coming up along the low spot on the east edge that suggested water access, and the grass under the overgrowth was the kind that grows where soil is good and has been left to its own devices. He stood in the middle of it for a while. He thought about Pearl in the winter of 1951, alone with Sadie, who was not yet 1 year old, walking into the bank in Bozeman and conducting the transaction that needed conducting. He thought about her not looking back at it. He thought about Clifford Mercer carrying the knowledge of what he had done for 44 years in the manner of a man who knows the carrying is his to do. He thought about Wyatt Mercer finding the one page in his grandfather's personal papers and spending 3 years looking for a name. He thought about the things that get passed forward, intended and unintended, the debts and the knowledge and the costs, and the acts of grace passing from hand to hand through the years in ways that the original hands could not have anticipated and would not have been able to fully trace if they had tried. He walked the full perimeter of the 40 acres before he went back to the truck. Nash Holloway called in December. The call was professional and somewhat stiff and lasted less than 5 minutes, which was the appropriate length for a call that needed to be made and that Nash would have preferred not to make. He said that the Expo committee had voted to rename the 1,000-yard challenge for the following year. He said the name they had chosen was the Croft Challenge. He said he understood if Silas did not wish to be involved, but that he wanted to inform him as a courtesy. Silas said he appreciated the call. He said he would not be attending the following year's event, but that he knew a range officer who might be available if the committee was looking for someone with relevant experience. Nash said he would be in touch with the committee. Silas said Nash. Nash said yes. Silas said the shot was there to be made. You built a good challenge. That part was right. There was a pause on Nash's end of the line that lasted long enough to suggest that Nash was recalibrating something. He said finally, "Thank you. I'll be in touch about the range officer." He was in touch. Hank Yardley served as range officer for the first Croft Challenge in September 1999, and every year for the 11 years after that, until his knees made the standing difficult, at which point he moved to the spotter's position, which required less standing and more of the other thing, the quality of attention that he had demonstrated on a ridge in February 1952, and had never fully stopped practicing. Wyatt Mercer competed in the first Croft Challenge. He was not wearing a sponsor shirt. He did not bring an energy drink. He brought the rifle he had been shooting since he was 17 years old, a Remington that his father had given him on the occasion of his first deer, and he shot it without modification and without ceremony. He did not make the shot. He came closer than 63 of the 64 men who had tried it at the original Expo, and when he stepped away from the bench, he shook Hank Yardley's hand and said he would be back next year. He was back the following year. He was back the year after that. He made the shot in the 5th year in a September with a crosswind that the spotters had not fully characterized until he had already factored it in, and the sound of the steel at 1,000 yards produced the same quality of silence in the crowd that it had produced the first time, which is to say the silence of people who have witnessed something that exceeds the category they had prepared for it. Silas was not there for it. He was in the workshop behind Sadie's house, which was also his house, the house that Pearl had made, and that persisted. He was working on a saddle that needed a new horn wrap and was giving him some trouble where the leather had stiffened in the cold. His thermos was on the bench beside the saddle, still the same thermos, still dented on the left side, still holding black coffee, the way it had held black coffee since 1953. His phone rang. He set down the leather tool and picked it up. Hank said Mercer made it. Silas said what distance. Hank said 1,040 yards. Wind was variable. He waited it out. Silas was quiet for a moment. He said, "Good." Hank said it was. You would have recognized it. Silas said, "I believe you." They stayed on the phone for a while after that, not saying much in the way of two men who have learned that silence between them is not an absence, but a medium, a shared space in which things that do not need words are allowed to simply exist, which is in the end the most accurate description of what a long friendship is. Outside the workshop, the Montana afternoon was doing what Montana afternoons do in September, moving through its light with the patience of something that has been doing this for longer than anyone watching and intends to continue long after. The corrugated roof was going its brief copper color in the east. The junipers along the drive were casting their thin shadows across the gravel. The left chair on the porch was in its position, as it had always been, as it would remain. In the corner of the workshop on the pegboard above the workbench hung 3 things in a row. The thermos was on the bench itself. On the pegboard there was the confirmation postcard from the Gallatin County Precision Rifle Expo, September 1998. Its corners slightly curled from the years held in place by a single tack. Below that, in a simple frame that Silas had made himself from workshop scraps, was Pearl's letter, both pages, the handwriting visible through the glass. And on the hook at the end of the row, hung with the same care given to a tool that has been well used and deserves to be found in good condition when needed, was a folded paper. Number 64. The most consequential things a careful man does are almost always invisible to the room until the moment they are not. And the moment they become visible is rarely the moment the man himself has chosen. It is the moment the world finally catches up to what he has already been, quietly for as long as it took, without announcement, without impatience, and without any particular interest in being seen. He put down the phone. He picked up the leather tool. He went back to work.